The Nurse from Pearl Harbor Act I. December 7, 1941. 0755 hours. Hickam Field, Territory of Hawaii. The sky explodes. Lieutenant Alice McKenzie, United States Army Nurse Corps, is walking across the base toward the hospital when the first wave hits. She's 26 years old, from Nebraska, graduated nursing school in 1938, enlisted in the Army in 1940 seeking adventure and escape from small-town life. She's been stationed at Hickam Field for 8 months, treating routine injuries and illnesses, boredom being the primary occupational hazard, military nursing in peacetime consisting mostly of treating sprains and influenza and homesickness disguised as physical ailments. The morning is beautiful, Sunday morning in paradise, temperature perfect, sky clear, the kind of day that makes assignment to Hawaii feel like vacation rather than military service. Alice is thinking about church service she's planning to attend at 0900, about letters she needs to write to her parents, about the officers' dance scheduled for next weekend. Ordinary thoughts for ordinary Sunday morning in place where war seems impossibly distant, where the Pacific Ocean provides buffer against European conflict, where American military power creates illusion of invulnerability. Then she hears aircraft engines, unusual sound for Sunday morning when most flying operations are suspended. She looks up, sees planes approaching low over the water, dozens of them, more aircraft than she's ever seen simultaneously. They're diving toward the harbor, toward the airfield, toward the neat rows of American aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip on Hickam's runway. Something is wrong. The approaching aircraft don't look American, their silhouettes unfamiliar, their formation too aggressive, their behavior too purposeful for training exercise. The first bomb hits the barracks, massive explosion that shatters windows across the base, that throws Alice to the ground from concussion alone, that announces unequivocally that this is not drill, not exercise, not mistake. This is attack. Real attack. Enemy attack. War has come to Hawaii, to Pearl Harbor, to this Sunday morning that was peaceful 30 seconds ago and will never be peaceful again. Alice lies flat, instinct overwhelming training, terror freezing her momentarily. The ground shakes from repeated explosions, bombs falling continuously, aircraft screaming overhead, machine guns firing, the sound building into overwhelming cacophony that drowns thought. She should move, should run, should seek shelter. But her body won't respond, shock paralyzing her, mind unable to process transition from peacetime routine to combat reality. Then training reasserts itself, professional identity overriding fear. She's nurse. People are wounded. That means work. That means duty. That means she needs to move toward the chaos, not away from it, needs to reach the hospital, needs to prepare for casualties that are certainly coming, that are probably already arriving. She forces herself upright, runs toward the hospital, debris falling around her, explosions lighting the morning, smoke beginning to obscure visibility. The hospital is chaos. Wounded are already arriving, men bleeding and burned and shocked, some walking, others carried by comrades, the casualties flooding in faster than the small Sunday morning staff can process. The hospital commander, Major Reynolds, sees Alice arrive, points her toward the emergency receiving area, shouts orders she can barely hear over continued explosions outside. No time for briefing, no time for preparation, no time for anything except immediate action. Alice grabs medical supplies, establishes triage position near the entrance, begins sorting casualties by severity. Walking wounded to the right, serious injuries to the left, critical cases straight to surgery, the brutal mathematics of battlefield medicine where not everyone can be treated immediately, where choices must be made, where some men die because resources go to others with better chances of survival. The first casualty she examines is sailor from the harbor, his clothing soaked with oil and seawater, his body covered with burns, skin hanging in strips, his eyes wide with shock and terror. He's trying to speak, to explain what happened, but his throat is damaged, his voice producing only choking sounds. Alice makes quick assessment, determines he's critical but probably savable, marks him for immediate surgery, calls for orderlies to move him to operating room. The next casualty is Army private, maybe 19 years old, his right arm shattered by shrapnel, bone visible through torn flesh, bleeding profusely. She applies tourniquet quickly, stops the bleeding, administers morphine for pain, marks him as serious but stable, sends him to holding area where he'll wait for surgery when operating rooms become available. He's crying, asking repeatedly if he'll lose the arm, if he'll be crippled, if his life is ruined. Alice lies automatically, tells him he'll be fine, that doctors will save the arm, that everything will be okay. She doesn't know if any of this is true, doesn't have time to evaluate prognosis honestly, just says what needs saying to keep him calm, to prevent shock from worsening his condition. More casualties arrive continuously, the stream never stopping, wounded appearing from everywhere, from ships in the harbor, from damaged aircraft, from buildings hit by bombs, from all across the base. Alice works mechanically, examining and sorting, making instant decisions, moving from patient to patient without pause. Her uniform is soaked with blood within 20 minutes, her hands slippery, her shoes squelching with fluids she doesn't want to identify. The hospital fills rapidly, exceeds capacity within an hour, wounded filling every available space, overflowing into corridors, into waiting rooms, into areas never designed for patient care. Additional medical personnel arrive, doctors and nurses called from quarters, from church services, from recreational activities, everyone summoned to emergency that dwarfs the hospital's resources and capabilities. Alice sees her first dead soldier around 0830, young man carried in by his friends, body limp, eyes vacant, life obviously gone. The men carrying him refuse to accept this reality, insist he's just unconscious, that doctors can save him, that he can't be dead because they were talking to him 10 minutes ago. Alice checks for pulse, finds nothing, confirms death, tries to explain gently that nothing can be done. The men become angry, accuse her of not trying hard enough, of giving up too easily, of betraying their friend. She has no time to argue, moves on to living patients who might benefit from her attention, leaving the dead man and his grieving friends behind. More dead arrive continuously, bodies accumulating in makeshift morgue being established in building adjacent to hospital, the dead outnumbering the living in some batches of casualties, entire crews killed together, brought in by survivors who escaped. Alice tries not to look at the morgue, tries to maintain focus on treatable patients, but the growing pile of bodies is unavoidable reminder of attack scale, of losses being suffered, of war's transformation from abstract concept to immediate reality. Around 0900, a second wave of Japanese aircraft arrives, renewing the attack, targeting facilities already damaged, finishing destruction begun by first wave. The explosions intensify, the ground shaking constantly, plaster falling from hospital ceilings, lights flickering, the building itself threatened by nearby hits. Alice works through the bombardment, ignoring danger, focused entirely on patients, on stopping bleeding and administering morphine and making triage decisions, her professional identity completely consuming personal fear. A bomb hits building adjacent to hospital, massive explosion that blows out windows, that throws Alice across the room, that temporarily deafens her, leaving her ears ringing and her balance disrupted. She's on the floor, disoriented, unsure initially what happened. She checks herself quickly, finds no serious injuries, just bruises and cuts from broken glass, nothing that prevents continued work. She forces herself upright, returns to triage, continues sorting casualties, blood streaming down her face from scalp wound she doesn't have time to treat. Another nurse, Lieutenant Sarah Chin, appears beside her, helps her stand, tries to examine her head wound. Alice pushes her away, insists she's fine, redirects attention to the wounded arriving continuously. Sarah argues briefly, then gives up, recognizes that Alice is beyond reasoning, is operating on adrenaline and professional obligation, will work until she collapses or the emergency ends, whichever comes first. The casualties from USS Arizona begin arriving around 0930, men pulled from burning water, bodies charred and broken, survivors of the battleship's catastrophic explosion, the magazine detonation that killed most of the crew instantly, that left only handful of survivors who escaped through impossible luck and circumstances. Alice treats Arizona survivor whose injuries are devastating, burns covering 60% of his body, both legs broken, internal bleeding obvious, prognosis essentially hopeless. She does what she can, makes him comfortable, administers maximum morphine dosage, stays with him while he dies, holding his hand, speaking quietly, ensuring he doesn't die alone even though she can't save him. This becomes pattern through the morning, treating patients she can't save, providing comfort when cure is impossible, witnessing deaths she's powerless to prevent. The training prepared her for clinical aspects of trauma care, for technical procedures and medical protocols, but nothing prepared her for emotional reality of mass casualty event, for watching young men die repeatedly, for making triage decisions that condemn some patients to death by allocating resources to others, for accumulating psychological damage that comes from continuous exposure to suffering and death. By 1000 hours, the attack is ending, Japanese aircraft withdrawing, the explosions becoming less frequent, the smoke beginning to clear enough to reveal the devastation. The harbor is burning, oil fires spreading across water, ships sinking or listing heavily, aircraft destroyed on runways, buildings collapsed or burning, infrastructure shattered. Pearl Harbor has been transformed from military showcase into disaster zone, American naval power crippled in single morning, invincibility proven to be illusion. But the hospital's crisis is intensifying, not ending. The wounded continue arriving, now bringing casualties from damaged ships, from rescue operations, from firefighting efforts, from recovery of trapped survivors. The initial wave of injured required immediate treatment for acute trauma. Now come the burns, the smoke inhalation cases, the crush injuries, the patients whose conditions deteriorated during rescue operations, who need intensive care that the overwhelmed hospital can barely provide. Alice works through the afternoon without break, without food or water, without pause for rest or treatment of her own injuries. Her scalp wound has stopped bleeding but hasn't been properly cleaned or bandaged, her clothes are soaked with combination of blood and sweat and other fluids, her hands are shaking from exhaustion and accumulated stress. She's operating on autopilot now, professional training so deeply ingrained that she can function despite exhaustion, despite trauma, despite psychological damage being inflicted by continuous exposure to horror. Around 1,400 hours she encounters a severely burned patient, young sailor pulled from USS West Virginia, his face and hands charred, his breathing labored from smoke inhalation, his pain obvious despite the morphine she administers. He keeps asking about his shipmates, wants to know who survived, who died, can't accept that most of his crew is gone, that he's among the fortunate few who escaped. Alice has no information about West Virginia casualties, doesn't know survival rates, can't answer his questions honestly. She lies again, tells him many survived, that his friends probably made it, that everything will be okay. She's become expert at these lies, at saying whatever provides comfort, at prioritizing emotional support over factual accuracy. The sailor doesn't believe her, can see through the lies, understands that she's trying to comfort him with false hope. But he accepts the gesture anyway, appreciates the attempt, recognizes that she's doing her best in an impossible situation. He thanks her quietly, asks her name so he can remember the nurse who helped him, who stayed with him, who didn't abandon him despite being obviously overwhelmed. She tells him her name, Alice McKenzie from Nebraska, asks his name in return. He's James Sullivan from Boston, 20 years old, naval career ending before it really started, life fundamentally altered by this morning's events. Alice moves on to next patient, and next, the work continuing endlessly, the emergency showing no signs of resolution. Evening approaches, the daylight fading, the fire still burning across the harbor, the smoke still rising, the destruction still being assessed. The hospital has received over 700 casualties during the day, more than triple its normal capacity, resources stretched impossibly thin, staff exhausted beyond normal human endurance. Major Reynolds finds Alice around 1800 hours, orders her to take break, to eat something, to rest for at least 30 minutes before continuing. She resists, insists she's needed, that patients are still arriving, that stopping is impossible. Reynolds insists more forcefully, reminds her that she's no use to patients if she collapses from exhaustion, that self-care is necessary for continued effectiveness, that this is order not suggestion. Alice finally complies, leaves her position reluctantly, walks to the cafeteria where emergency food service has been established. She sits at a table, stares at the food placed in front of her, unable to eat, her stomach rebelling against the thought of consumption. Her hands are still shaking, covered in dried blood she hasn't had opportunity to wash off, her uniform stiff with biological fluids. She feels disconnected from her body, like she's observing herself from distance, like the person sitting at this table isn't really her, like she's somehow separated from reality by the day's trauma. Another nurse joins her, Lieutenant Mary Sullivan, older woman with 20 years of experience, veteran of World War I, someone who's seen mass casualties before. Mary doesn't speak initially, just sits quietly, recognizing that Alice needs presence more than words, that companionship matters more than conversation. After several minutes, Mary speaks quietly. First time in combat nursing. I can tell. You did well today. Saved lives. Made difference. But you're also damaged. This kind of work damages everyone. Changes you permanently. You won't be the same person you were this morning. That Alice McKenzie died today, same as those boys in the morgue. You're someone different now. Someone who's seen things that can't be unseen, who knows things that can't be unknown. Welcome to war. It's hell. And it's just beginning. Alice nods slowly, unable to articulate response, recognizing truth in Mary's words, understanding that today was transformation, was initiation into reality she'd been protected from by peacetime service, by distance from conflict, by assumption that war would remain somewhere else, affecting someone else, never touching her personally. But war has touched her now, has marked her permanently, has destroyed her innocence and replaced it with knowledge she wishes she didn't possess. The break ends too quickly, 30 minutes feeling like 30 seconds, the return to work inevitable and dreaded simultaneously. Alice stands, walks back to the emergency area, resumes her position in the endless stream of wounded, continues the work that will define the rest of her day, her week, her war. She's different now, transformed by Pearl Harbor, by the morning that destroyed American peace and Alice McKenzie's assumption that she could serve in military medicine without experiencing war's reality. The sun sets over Pearl Harbor, smoke still rising from burning ships, fire still consuming wreckage, the destruction still being discovered and assessed. Alice works through the night, treating patients continuously, watching more die, saving some, losing others, making impossible choices, carrying psychological burden that grows heavier with each decision, with each death, with each moment of exposure to suffering she's powerless to completely relieve. This is Pearl Harbor. This is war. This is her introduction to reality that will define the next 4 years, that will consume her youth and transform her into someone she doesn't recognize, someone marked permanently by this day, by these wounds, by these deaths, by this moment when peace ended and war began and Alice McKenzie the peacetime nurse died and was replaced by Lieutenant McKenzie the combat nurse, the survivor, the witness, the woman who will carry Pearl Harbor with her forever, unable to forget, unable to escape, unable to return to the person she was 12 hours ago when the morning was beautiful and the sky was clear and war was impossibly distant. The wounded keep coming. Alice keeps working. The night continues. Pearl Harbor burns. And nothing will ever be the same again. The Nurse from Pearl Harbor, Act 2. December 8, 1941. Dawn breaks over Pearl Harbor, revealing devastation that seemed almost unreal in darkness. Alice has worked through the entire night, 24 hours without sleep, her body operating on reserves that don't exist, adrenaline and professional obligation sustaining her beyond normal human capacity. The hospital is still overwhelmed, casualties still arriving, though the flow has decreased from the initial flood to manageable stream, emergency stabilizing into crisis management, acute disaster transitioning into long-term recovery operation. She's been rotated to the surgical ward, assisting with postoperative care, monitoring patients who survived initial treatment, watching for complications, administering medications, providing comfort to men whose lives have been fundamentally altered by yesterday's attack. The ward is packed beyond capacity, beds arranged so close together that movement between them requires careful navigation, wounded men lying shoulder to shoulder, privacy impossible, suffering shared collectively. Alice moves from bed to bed, checking vital signs, changing dressings, administering morphine to those in pain, speaking quietly to those who are conscious, providing human contact to men who are terrified and disoriented and far from home. Many of the patients are barely conscious, sedated heavily, their bodies fighting infections and trauma, their survival uncertain. Others are alert but wish they weren't, their injuries forcing awareness of damage that will define the rest of their lives, amputations and burns and disabilities that can't be undone, futures fundamentally different from what they imagined yesterday morning. One patient, the young sailor James Sullivan she treated yesterday, is awake when she reaches his bed, his burned face showing recognition despite the bandages, his eyes following her movement, his hand reaching out weakly in greeting. Alice takes his hand carefully, mindful of the burns covering his skin, the tissue damage that makes even gentle touch painful. He tries to speak but his throat is damaged from smoke inhalation, his voice producing only whispers. Did we win? He manages finally, the question reflecting confusion about what happened, about what the attack means, about whether yesterday was battle or disaster or something else entirely. Alice doesn't know how to answer, uncertain what winning means in context of Pearl Harbor, whether survival counts as victory or whether victory requires something more. We're still here, she says finally. The base is damaged but functional. The hospital is treating everyone who can be treated. We're recovering. That's something. Sullivan nods weakly, accepting this non-answer, recognizing that she doesn't have better information, that nobody knows yet what Pearl Harbor means strategically, what the attack accomplished, what happens next. He closes his eyes, exhausted from brief conversation, his body demanding rest, his mind unable to process the implications of his situation. Alice continues through the ward, each patient presenting different combination of injuries and psychological trauma, each requiring individual attention and care that the overwhelmed staff can barely provide. She reaches a Marine corporal whose left leg was amputated above the knee yesterday, the limb crushed beyond saving when building collapsed on him during the attack. He's awake, staring at the space where his leg should be, his expression showing the horrified realization that his body is permanently changed, that his identity as Marine and as whole person has been altered fundamentally. She approaches carefully, uncertain what to say, how to provide comfort to someone experiencing loss that can't be minimized or explained away. He speaks before she can, his voice bitter and angry. 21 years old. One leg. What the fuck am I supposed to do now? I can't be a Marine. Can't do anything I planned. My whole life just ended and it hasn't even started yet. Alice has no good answer, no comforting words that address this reality honestly. She could offer platitudes about prosthetics and adaptation and men who've lived full lives despite disabilities, but those words feel hollow, dismissive of his legitimate grief and rage. Instead, she simply acknowledges the loss. You're right. This is terrible and unfair and it's going to change everything for you. I can't make that better. Nobody can. I'm sorry. The honesty surprises him, breaks through his anger briefly, creates moment of genuine connection. Most medical staff default to optimistic reassurances, to emphasizing what's possible rather than acknowledging what's lost. Alice's refusal to do this, her willingness to validate his grief without trying to fix it, provides strange comfort, recognition that his feelings are legitimate, that his situation is truly terrible, that he's not crazy or weak for being devastated. Thank you, he says quietly, for not lying. For not telling me everything will be fine when we both know it won't be. That means something. Alice nods, squeezes his hand gently, moves on to next patient. She's learning that combat nursing requires different approach than peacetime medicine, that physical treatment is only part of the work, that psychological care matters as much as technical competence, that sometimes honesty serves better than optimism, that witnessing suffering matters even when you can't eliminate it. Morning brings shift change, new nurses arriving to relieve night staff, fresh personnel replacing exhausted ones. Major Reynolds finds Alice again, orders her to go to quarters, to sleep for at least 6 hours before returning. She resists again, habitual response, insistence that she's needed. Reynolds is firmer this time, threatens to make rest mandatory medical order if she doesn't comply voluntarily, reminds her that this is marathon not sprint, that the war just started, that she needs to maintain long-term capability rather than burning out immediately. Alice finally agrees, leaves the hospital, walks across the base toward nurses' quarters. The morning light reveals devastation more clearly than darkness did, buildings destroyed or damaged, aircraft wreckage scattered across runways, debris everywhere, the base transformed from orderly military installation into disaster zone. Work crews are already clearing rubble, repairing essential infrastructure, beginning the massive reconstruction effort that will occupy months. She reaches her quarters, a small room she shares with another nurse, Lieutenant Patricia Morrison, who's also just returning from the hospital. They look at each other silently, too exhausted for conversation, both marked by same experience, both carrying same weight. Patricia speaks finally, her voice flat with fatigue. I was supposed to write my fiancé yesterday. Tell him about the beautiful Hawaiian sunset, about how lucky I am to be stationed here, about planning our wedding when my service ends. Now I don't know what to write. How do you describe yesterday? How do you explain what we saw? Alice has no answer, understanding the problem intimately, recognizing that gap between their experience and anything they can communicate to people who weren't there, who didn't witness the attack, who can't comprehend the scale of destruction and suffering, who still live in a world where Pearl Harbor is news rather than lived reality. She showers, the water running red from dried blood washing off her body, from injuries she didn't know she had, from fluids absorbed into her clothing and skin during 24 hours of continuous trauma care. The hot water should feel good, should provide comfort and relief, but she's too numb to appreciate it, too exhausted to feel anything except overwhelming fatigue. She dries mechanically, puts on clean uniform, lies on her bed, closes her eyes. Sleep doesn't come. She's too tired to sleep, too wired from adrenaline, too haunted by images that replay continuously, wounded men and burning ships and the young sailor asking if they won, the Marine corporal staring at his missing leg, the Arizona survivor dying while holding her hand. She lies awake, staring at ceiling, her body demanding rest her mind won't permit, trapped between exhaustion and inability to escape consciousness. Patricia is similarly unable to sleep, lying on her own bed, staring at nothing, processing the same trauma through same mechanisms of exhaustion and psychological overload. They lie in silence for an hour, both awake, both unable to rest, both marked by Pearl Harbor in ways that will never completely heal. Eventually Alice gives up on sleep, returns to the hospital earlier than ordered, unable to stay away, needing the work to distract from thoughts, needing patients to focus on rather than memories to process. The hospital staff has expanded, medical personnel arriving from other bases, from civilian hospitals in Honolulu, from ships that escaped damage, reinforcements mobilizing to address the overwhelming casualty load. Alice is assigned to the burns unit, specialized ward established to treat the large number of burn victims from the attack, sailors pulled from burning oil on the water, airmen caught in aircraft fires, personnel trapped in burning buildings. The burns unit is nightmare ward, patients wrapped in bandages, their skin damaged beyond recognition, their pain managed by morphine that's never quite sufficient, their prognosis uncertain, infection risk high, survival dependent on nursing care that must be meticulous and continuous. She's paired with Mary Sullivan, the experienced nurse from yesterday, working under her supervision, learning burn care techniques, the delicate process of debriding dead tissue, changing dressings, monitoring for infection, providing pain management. Mary teaches while working, explains procedures, demonstrates techniques, maintains professional composure that Alice struggles to match. Burns are hardest injuries to treat, Mary explains while changing dressing on patient whose entire back was burned. They're intensely painful, prone to infection, require constant care. The patients suffer continuously, can't escape the pain, can't rest properly, can't heal quickly. And we have to hurt them more to help them, have to debride the wounds, have to change dressings, have to cause pain to prevent worse outcomes. It's brutal work. You have to develop calluses, psychological ones, or it destroys you. Alice watches Mary work, sees the practiced efficiency, the gentle touch combined with clinical detachment, the balance between compassion and emotional distance that allows sustained effectiveness. She tries to emulate this approach, to maintain professional composure while providing care, to feel enough to be compassionate but not so much that she's overwhelmed by patients' suffering. But the balance is difficult, perhaps impossible for someone without Mary's experience, without years of practice managing emotional response to trauma. Alice finds herself crying while changing dressings, tears streaming down her face as she causes pain to patient who's already suffering enormously, who begs her to stop, who can't understand that the treatment is necessary, that temporary pain prevents worse outcomes. She apologizes continuously, hates herself for causing suffering, wishes there was better way, gentler method, treatment that didn't require inflicting pain to provide care. Mary watches this breakdown with sympathy but doesn't intervene, recognizes that Alice needs to process this herself, needs to learn to manage emotional response, needs to develop coping mechanisms that will sustain her through the war. After Alice finishes the dressing change, Mary pulls her aside, speaks quietly. You can't cry for every patient. Can't carry their pain personally. You'll destroy yourself within weeks if you do. You need to develop distance, separation between their suffering and your emotional response. Feel enough to be competent and compassionate. But not so much that you can't function. It's harsh advice, sounds cruel, but it's necessary for survival in this work. Alice nods, understanding intellectually even if she can't yet implement emotionally, recognizing that Mary is describing essential skill, professional requirement, psychological adaptation necessary for sustained effectiveness in combat nursing. She wipes her tears, takes deep breath, forces composure, returns to work with renewed determination to maintain control, to provide care without emotional collapse. The days blur together, December 8th becoming 9th becoming 10th, the emergency gradually transitioning into routine, acute crisis becoming sustained operation, the hospital adapting to wartime medicine, staff developing procedures and protocols for managing mass casualties, for prioritizing care, for coping with losses that can't be prevented. Alice works 12-hour shifts, sometimes longer when staff shortages require extended hours, sometimes double shifts when casualties arrive unexpectedly, her life reduced to work and brief inadequate rest and return to work. She develops the emotional calluses Mary described, learns to maintain professional distance, to feel appropriate compassion without personal devastation, to witness suffering without being consumed by it. The transformation is gradual and incomplete, requiring conscious effort, deliberate management of emotional response, but it allows continued functioning, permits sustained effectiveness despite continuous exposure to trauma. But the psychological cost is significant, accumulating daily, building into burden she carries constantly. She has nightmares when she sleeps, dreams of burning men and sinking ships and endless streams of wounded, her subconscious processing trauma her conscious mind suppresses during working hours. She loses weight, unable to eat properly, her appetite suppressed by stress and exhaustion and the constant exposure to blood and suffering that makes food seem obscene. She becomes withdrawn, less social, unable to engage in casual conversation that feels trivial compared to life and death decisions she makes daily. Her letters home change character, transformed from cheerful descriptions of Hawaiian paradise to brief factual accounts that reveal nothing about her actual experience, that protect her parents from knowledge of what she's witnessing, that maintain fiction that she's fine, that military nursing is rewarding and meaningful and not destroying her psychologically. She can't tell them the truth, can't explain Pearl Harbor honestly, can't share the reality of her work without causing worry she can't alleviate, so she lies, creates narrative version of herself who's coping well, who's proud of her service, who's excited about contributing to the war effort. Christmas approaches, marking 3 weeks since the attack, 3 weeks of continuous operation, 3 weeks of treating wounded and watching some die and learning to cope with losses that continue accumulating. The hospital organizes Christmas celebration for patients, decorations and carols and special meals, attempt to provide normalcy and festive atmosphere despite circumstances. Medical staff participates with forced enthusiasm, maintaining cheer they don't feel, providing comfort to patients who need distraction from their suffering. Alice works Christmas Day, her shift in the burns unit, caring for patients whose injuries make celebration impossible, whose pain persists despite holiday, whose suffering doesn't pause for calendar dates. She helps distribute gifts donated by local civilians, small packages of toiletries and candy and letters from strangers expressing support and gratitude, gestures that provide minimal comfort but at least acknowledge the wounded men's sacrifice. One patient, young sailor named Robert Chin whose face was burned beyond recognition, receives package from his family in California, letter and photos and small wrapped gifts sent before they learned about his injuries, before they knew he'd been at Pearl Harbor, still addressing him as the person he was before December 7th. He can't open the package himself, his hand's too damaged, so Alice opens it for him, holds each item up for him to see, reads the letter aloud. The letter is cheerful and ordinary, his mother describing family news, his sister talking about school, his father mentioning work and weather and plans for Robert's next leave. It was written in November, before Pearl Harbor, before everything changed, coming from world where Robert was whole and safe and planning future that no longer exists. The disconnect between the letter's cheerful normalcy and Robert's current reality is crushing, highlighting everything that's been lost, everything that can't be recovered. Robert cries while Alice reads, tears running down his damaged face, his body shaking with sobs he tries to suppress, his grief overwhelming despite the morphine meant to dull all sensation. Alice sets the letter aside, holds his hand carefully, lets him cry without trying to stop him, understanding that grief needs expression, that suppressing emotion causes more damage than releasing it. She stays with him until the crying subsides, until exhaustion overwhelms emotion, until he falls asleep still holding her hand. This becomes defining moment for Alice, crystallization of what Pearl Harbor means, what the attack accomplished beyond strategic objectives and tactical outcomes. It didn't just damage ships and kill sailors and destroy infrastructure. It shattered lives, erased futures, transformed young men from whole people with plans and hopes into wounded survivors whose existence is defined by loss and pain and permanent alteration. The physical wounds will heal partially, some men will recover, will adapt, will build new lives. But something essential died on December 7th for all of them, for the wounded and the caregivers both, innocence and assumption of safety and belief that war was something that happened elsewhere to other people. Alice understands now what Mary meant about being changed permanently, about being different person than she was before Pearl Harbor. The Alice McKenzie who arrived in Hawaii 8 months ago, who expected peaceful service and tropical paradise and adventure without danger, that person is gone completely, replaced by someone harder and more capable and more damaged, someone who knows too much, who's seen too much, who carries weight that can't be shared with people who weren't there. New Year's 1942 arrives, marking transition from year of peace to year of war, from pre-Pearl Harbor world to post-Pearl Harbor reality. The hospital marks the occasion minimally, brief recognition that calendar has changed, that time continues despite trauma, that life persists even when it feels like everything ended 3 weeks ago. Alice works through the new year, her shift in surgery, assisting with procedures, learning new skills, expanding capability, becoming more competent and more damaged simultaneously. She's requested by a patient in post-operative recovery, Marine Corporal she'd spoken honestly with about his amputated leg, who specifically asks for the nurse who didn't lie to him, who acknowledged his loss without minimizing it. She finds him awake, his recovery progressing well physically, his psychological adjustment still struggling. He wants to talk, needs to process his situation with someone who'll be honest, who won't offer false comfort. I've been thinking about what you said, he begins. About this being terrible and unfair. You were right. It is. But I'm starting to think maybe terrible and unfair doesn't mean hopeless. Maybe I can't be the Marine I planned to be, can't do what I wanted. But maybe I can be something else, do something different, live a life that's not the one I planned but still worth living. Does that make sense? Or am I just fooling myself? Alice considers carefully before responding, recognizing that this conversation matters, that her honesty helped him before and might help again. I think you're being realistic. Accepting what's lost but not surrendering to despair. That's incredibly difficult. Most people can't do it. But you're right that terrible and unfair doesn't automatically mean hopeless. Your life is different now. That's unchangeable. But different doesn't have to mean worthless. It just means you're building something you didn't plan, adapting to circumstances you didn't choose. That takes more courage than following the plan ever would have. He nods slowly, processing this validation, drawing strength from her refusal to lie or minimize while also refusing to confirm his darkest fears. Thank you, again, for treating me like an adult who can handle truth. For not pretending everything's fine when it obviously isn't. That matters more than you probably realize. Alice leaves this conversation feeling something she hasn't felt since December 7th. That her work matters beyond technical competence, beyond clinical care, that presence and honesty in witnessing provide value that can't be measured in successful treatments or survival rates. She's helping in ways she didn't expect, in ways nursing school didn't prepare her for, in ways that require psychological strength more than technical skill. But this realization doesn't reduce the burden, doesn't ease the accumulating trauma, doesn't protect her from damage that continuous exposure to suffering creates. She's helping others while destroying herself, maintaining functionality while fragmenting internally, providing care while needing care she won't seek and probably couldn't receive. This is the reality of combat nursing, the profession's dark underbelly, the cost that medical textbooks don't mention and recruitment materials don't acknowledge. January continues, Pearl Harbor settling into wartime routine, the base recovering physically while personnel carry invisible wounds, reconstruction proceeding while people process trauma that can't be rebuilt like damaged infrastructure. Alice continues working, continues adapting, continues surviving shifts that feel impossible, continues witnessing suffering she's powerless to eliminate, continues being changed by experiences she can't escape or forget. She's become someone she doesn't recognize, someone harder and more capable and more broken than the person she was before December 7th. The transformation isn't complete and won't be complete until the war ends, however long that takes, however much more damage accumulates. She's Pearl Harbor survivor now, marked permanently by the attack, by the wounded she's treated, by the dead she's witnessed, by the impossible choices she's made, by the accumulating psychological cost of caring for people who can't be made whole. The war has just begun. Years remain ahead, more battles, more casualties, more trauma. Alice will survive them, will continue serving, will become more skilled and more damaged, will help thousands of wounded men while destroying herself incrementally, will give everything she has to the work while receiving nothing except the knowledge that she did her duty, that she didn't abandon the wounded, that she stayed when staying was impossibly hard. This is Pearl Harbor's legacy, written in wounded bodies and damaged psyches and transformed lives. Alice McKenzie carries this legacy, will carry it forever, surviving witness to attack that changed everything, to mourning when peace ended and war began and young nurse from Nebraska learned what war really means, what it costs, what it takes from everyone who experiences it directly. She survived December 7th. But part of her died that day anyway, consumed by flames and blood and endless suffering, sacrificed to war that demanded more than she knew she had but somehow found anyway. The wounded need her. She returns to work. The war continues. Pearl Harbor burns in memory though the physical fires are long extinguished. And Alice McKenzie, changed forever, damaged permanently, continues serving because that's what nurses do, what duty demands, what the wounded deserve regardless of cost to the caregiver. This is her war now. This is her life. This is who Pearl Harbor made her. And she'll carry it until the end, however far away that end might be, however much more she has to give before giving finally breaks her completely. The Nurse from Pearl Harbor, Act 3. August 1945. Letterman General Hospital, San Francisco, California. The war is over. Japan surrendered 3 days ago, August 15th, the announcement triggering celebrations across America. Dancing in streets, strangers embracing, the joy of victory and relief of survival erupting spontaneously. The war that began at Pearl Harbor has ended with atomic bombs and unconditional surrender, 4 years of combat concluded, millions dead, world fundamentally transformed. Lieutenant Alice McKenzie, now Captain McKenzie after field promotion, stands at window in the hospital's administrative wing, watching celebrations in the city below, hearing cheers and car horns and church bells, observing joy she can't quite feel, victory that seems abstract and distant despite its immediacy. She's 30 years old, looks 45, her body aged by 4 years of continuous service, by Pearl Harbor and the campaigns that followed, by thousands of wounded treated, by accumulated trauma that's transformed her into someone barely recognizable as the young nurse who walked across Hickam Field on December 7, 1941. She served the entire war, Pearl Harbor to surrender, 4 years of combat nursing across the Pacific. After Pearl Harbor came the hospital ship USS Solace, treating casualties from Midway and Guadalcanal and Tarawa. Then field hospitals in the Philippines, in Okinawa, at the forward edge of combat, treating wounded within sound of artillery, working in tents and damaged buildings, operating under conditions that made Pearl Harbor seem almost comfortable in retrospect. She's seen everything war can do to human bodies, has witnessed suffering in every possible form, has made impossible decisions thousands of times, has carried psychological burden that's crushed her incrementally, day by day, patient by patient, death by death. She's been back in the States for 2 months, rotated home after Okinawa, assigned to Letterman General treating returning casualties, soldiers and Marines and sailors being evacuated back to American hospitals for extended care and rehabilitation. It's supposed to be easier duty, reward for 4 years overseas, respite before inevitable discharge and return to civilian life. But it's not easier. The wounded here are different category, men damaged beyond field hospital capability, requiring specialized treatment, long-term care, facing disabilities that will define the rest of their lives. She sees the end results here, the permanent costs of war, what happens to the wounded after acute crisis ends and long adaptation begins. The hospital is celebrating victory along with the rest of the country, staff organizing parties for mobile patients, decorations throughout the wards, special meals, relaxation of normal protocols to permit festivity. Alice participates minimally, attends briefly, makes appearance sufficient to avoid questions, then retreats to her quarters, unable to share the joy, unable to feel what everyone else seems to feel, unable to believe that war's end means anything has fundamentally changed. She's tried to reconnect with family, to rebuild relationships damaged by 4 years of absence and transformation. Her parents came to San Francisco to see her, traveled from Nebraska filled with pride and relief, expecting reunion with daughter they remembered, with Alice from before the war. But that Alice is gone, replaced by stranger wearing her face, speaking her voice, sharing nothing essential with person they knew. The visit was disaster, painful for everyone, her parents unable to understand her distance, her emotional flatness, her inability to engage with their attempts at normal conversation. They left after 3 days, confused and hurt, writing letters afterward expressing concern, suggesting she needs rest, proposing she come home for extended visit after discharge. But Alice can't go home, can't return to Nebraska, can't imagine herself in small-town life where nothing has changed, where war was distant news rather than lived reality, where people know nothing about what she experienced and can't understand even if she tried to explain. She's trapped between 2 worlds, unable to return to civilian life, unable to continue military service once the war ends and the army demobilizes, unable to exist comfortably in either world, permanently displaced by experiences that separated her fundamentally from normal life. She's been meeting with Army psychiatrist, Major David Foster, required evaluation before discharge, assessment of psychological fitness for civilian transition. The sessions are uncomfortable, Foster asking questions she doesn't want to answer, probing experiences she's tried to suppress, identifying trauma she's attempted to ignore. He's kind and competent and infuriatingly perceptive, seeing through her defenses, recognizing the damage she's carrying, understanding that she's barely functional despite appearing capable. Today's session, scheduled for this afternoon, will be difficult. Foster has been building toward formal diagnosis, toward recommendations that might delay her discharge, that might require treatment she doesn't want, that might officially label her as damaged in ways that feel like admission of failure, of weakness, of inability to cope with what war demanded. She arrives at his office precisely on time, habit of military punctuality deeply ingrained, sits in the chair facing his desk, waits for the questioning to begin. Foster looks at her with expression mixing professional concern and personal sympathy, recognizing that what he needs to say will hurt, that diagnosis and treatment recommendations are necessary even though they'll feel like judgment. Alice, he begins, using her first name as he's done throughout their sessions, informal approach meant to establish connection. I've completed my evaluation. I need to discuss my findings with you, explain my recommendations, talk about what happens next. This isn't easy conversation, but it's necessary. Alice nods, steeling herself, preparing for formal confirmation of what she already knows, that she's broken, that war destroyed her, that she's not capable of normal life, that she'll carry Pearl Harbor and everything after forever. Foster continues carefully. You're exhibiting clear symptoms of what we're calling war neurosis, what some are starting to call combat fatigue or operational exhaustion. Your nightmares, your hypervigilance, your emotional numbing, your inability to feel joy or connect emotionally with others, your persistent re-experiencing of traumatic events, all of these are consistent with severe psychological trauma. You've been in continuous combat conditions for 4 years, treating casualties at the most intense points of the war, experiencing sustained exposure to death and suffering that would overwhelm anyone. Alice listens without responding, hearing confirmation of diagnosis she expected, official labeling of conditions she's been living with for years. My recommendation, Foster says slowly, is that you remain on active duty for at least 6 months after formal discharge date, receiving treatment here at Letterman, working with psychiatric staff to process the trauma, to develop coping mechanisms, to prepare for civilian transition. You're not ready to be discharged into civilian life right now. You need support, need treatment, need time to heal before you try to rebuild normal existence. Alice shakes her head immediately, rejecting the recommendation instinctively. I'm fine. I've been doing my job effectively for 4 years. I don't need treatment. I just need to finish my service and move on with my life. Foster sighs, recognizing the denial, the resistance to acknowledging vulnerability. You're not fine, Alice. You're functioning barely through force of will and professional training. But you're deeply damaged. The nightmares, the inability to eat properly, the social isolation, the emotional flatness, these aren't normal reactions. They're symptoms of severe psychological trauma that will destroy you if left untreated. I've seen this pattern in hundreds of veterans. Refusing treatment doesn't make you strong. It makes you vulnerable to complete breakdown that could come months or years from now, that could cost you everything if you don't address it now. Alice wants to argue, wants to insist she's capable, wants to prove she doesn't need help. But she's too tired for pretense, too exhausted to maintain fiction that she's okay, too damaged to believe her own denials. What does treatment involve? She asks finally, surrender disguised as practical question. Talk therapy primarily, Foster explains. Working through your experiences, processing the trauma you've suppressed, learning to integrate what happened into coherent narrative rather than carrying it as disconnected horror. Also practical skills, stress management techniques, methods for managing nightmares and hypervigilance, strategies for rebuilding emotional capacity that trauma has suppressed. It's hard work, painful work, requires confronting memories you'd prefer to avoid. But it's necessary if you want any chance at normal life after discharge. Alice considers this, weighs the prospect of 6 more months of military service, of extended time in hospital environment she's desperate to escape, of forced processing of trauma she's tried to bury. But she also recognizes truth in Foster's assessment, understands that she's not capable of civilian transition in current state, that refusing treatment means probable breakdown, that she needs help even though accepting help feels like admitting defeat. Okay, she says quietly. I'll stay. I'll do the treatment. 6 months. Then I'm done with all of this. Foster nods, satisfied but not triumphant, recognizing that Alice's agreement is beginning not end, that treatment will be difficult, that 6 months might not be sufficient but at least it's start. Thank you. I think you've made right decision even though it doesn't feel that way now. The treatment begins the following week, individual sessions with Foster 3 times weekly, group therapy with other combat nurses facing similar issues, structured activities designed to rebuild emotional capacity and social connection. Alice participates reluctantly, maintaining minimum engagement, completing required activities without genuine investment, treating therapy like mission to be accomplished rather than healing to be experienced. The individual sessions are particularly difficult, Foster probing specific memories, asking her to describe experiences in detail, to process emotions she's suppressed, to confront trauma she's avoided thinking about for years. He asks about Pearl Harbor, about specific patients she remembers, about deaths that haunt her, about choices she regrets, about moments that defined her transformation from peacetime nurse to combat veteran. She tells him about the first dead soldier, about learning to triage, about lying to wounded men about their prognosis, about the burned sailor James Sullivan asking if they won, about the Marine corporal with the amputated leg, about developing emotional calluses that allowed continued functioning, about the Christmas package that made wounded sailor cry, about 1,000 other moments that accumulate into unbearable weight she carries constantly. Foster listens without judgment, without trying to fix or minimize, simply witnessing her experience, acknowledging the trauma, validating that what she carries is genuinely terrible, that her reactions are normal responses to abnormal circumstances, that she's not weak or broken or failed, just damaged by experiences that would damage anyone. You're describing moral injury, Foster explains after a particularly difficult session about triage decisions. It's distinct from other forms of trauma. It's not just fear or horror at what you witnessed. It's damage to your sense of right and wrong, to your belief in your own goodness, to your faith in moral order of the world. You had to make choices that violated your values, that went against your nursing training, that required you to let some patients die so others could live. Those choices were necessary and correct in context, but they still damaged you morally, still violated something essential about who you believed yourself to be. Alice recognizes truth in this description, understanding that her suffering isn't just about what she witnessed but about what she did, about choices she made, about complicity in suffering even when that suffering couldn't be prevented. How do you heal from that? She asks, genuinely wanting to know, desperate for answer that might reduce the burden. You don't heal completely, Foster says honestly. Moral injury leaves permanent scars. But you can learn to carry it differently, to integrate it into your identity rather than fighting it, to accept that you made terrible choices in terrible circumstances, that you did the best possible given impossible situations, that your worth as person isn't determined by decisions you were forced to make. It's about self-forgiveness ultimately, about accepting your humanity including your limitations, about releasing guilt that serves no purpose except continuing to punish you for choices that couldn't have been different. Alice struggles with this concept, unable to forgive herself, unable to accept that she did her best when her best meant men died, when her choices resulted in suffering, when her limitations had fatal consequences. But she continues therapy, continues processing, continues attempting to integrate experiences she's carried as separate trauma, as moments of horror disconnected from coherent narrative of her war service. The group therapy sessions are a different challenge, forcing her to interact with other nurses who share similar experiences, who carry similar burdens, who understand what civilian therapists and family members can't comprehend. The group meets twice weekly, 8 combat nurses all struggling with post-war transition, all carrying trauma they can't escape, all trying to figure out how to exist in a world that's moved on while they remain stuck in war that technically ended. Alice is resistant initially, unwilling to share with strangers, uncomfortable with vulnerability, protective of privacy she's maintained for 4 years. But gradually the group breaks down her defenses, the shared experience creating safety, the recognition of common suffering permitting honesty, the knowledge that these women understand allowing her to speak truths she's told no one else. She describes her emotional numbness, her inability to feel joy or connection, her sense that she died at Pearl Harbor and has been functioning as ghost ever since, present physically but absent emotionally, alive biologically but dead in every way that matters. The other nurses nod in recognition, several describing similar experiences, the sense of being permanently separated from normal life, of watching from outside, of never quite connecting with post-war reality. One nurse, Captain Sarah Martinez, who served in field hospitals across Europe, describes it perfectly: we're ghosts haunting our own lives. The war killed us, killed the people we were before, but our bodies kept functioning, kept doing the work. Now the war's over and we're supposed to return to life, but we don't know how. We're dead women walking, trying to pretend we're alive, trying to fit into a world that has no place for what we've become. The description resonates with Alice deeply, articulates feelings she's had for years but couldn't express, captures exactly what Pearl Harbor and the war did to her. She's ghost, permanently displaced from life, unable to return but unable to move forward, trapped in liminal space between death and living. But the group also provides something unexpected: connection. Not friendship exactly, nothing as simple as that, but recognition, witnessing, acknowledgement of shared experience that no one else can understand. The other nurses see her as she actually is, not as she pretends to be, not as family wants her to be, not as army expects her to be. They see the damage, the brokenness, the ghost. And they accept it because they're ghosts too, because they're broken too, because they all carry the same unbearable weight. Months pass slowly. September becomes October, becomes November. The hospital is discharging patients rapidly, returning recovered soldiers to civilian life, closing wards, reducing staff, transitioning from wartime to peacetime operations. Alice continues her treatment, continues therapy, continues struggling to process 4 years of trauma that can't be processed quickly or easily. She's making progress according to Foster, developing coping mechanisms, beginning to integrate her experiences, slowly rebuilding capacity for emotional engagement. But progress feels minimal, improvements subtle enough to be invisible, healing so gradual it's imperceptible day to day. She still has nightmares most nights, still wakes screaming from dreams of burning ships and wounded men and triage decisions that haunt her. She still can't eat normally, her weight remaining dangerously low, her body refusing nutrition, her system damaged by years of stress and suppressed emotion. She still isolates socially, unable to engage in casual conversation, unable to find common ground with people who didn't experience combat. December approaches, marking 4 years since Pearl Harbor, anniversary of day everything changed, of mourning when her life divided into before and after, into Alice McKenzie who existed prior to December 7th and Captain McKenzie who emerged from the attack fundamentally transformed. The hospital is planning memorial service, honoring the fallen, acknowledging the anniversary, creating space for collective remembrance. Alice is asked to speak at the service, to represent the nurses who served, to share her experience of Pearl Harbor and what followed. She's reluctant, uncomfortable with public speaking, uncertain what to say, how to capture 4 years in brief remarks, how to honor the dead honestly without overwhelming the living with truth of what war cost. But she agrees finally, recognizing obligation, understanding that her voice matters, that her testimony serves purposes beyond personal comfort. December 7, 1945. 4 years exactly since the attack. The memorial service is held in the hospital chapel. Attendance large, patients and staff both, veterans who were at Pearl Harbor, nurses who served in the Pacific, doctors who treated casualties from the attack and the campaigns that followed. Alice sits in front row, her prepared remarks in her pocket, her mind racing with memories of 4 years ago, of beautiful Sunday morning that exploded into chaos, of wounded flooding the hospital, of learning what war meant through immediate immersion in its worst realities. The service begins with prayer, with hymns, with official remarks from hospital commander acknowledging the anniversary, honoring the fallen, celebrating the victory that was won at such terrible cost. Then Alice is introduced, invited to speak, to share her perspective as nurse who was there, who witnessed the attack, who spent the war treating its consequences. She walks to the podium, looks at the audience, sees faces marked by war in different ways, wounded bodies and damaged psyches and the invisible scars everyone carries, the shared experience of surviving conflict that killed so many, that transformed everyone it touched. She begins speaking, her voice quiet but carrying in the silent chapel. 4 years ago this morning I was walking across Hickam Field, thinking about church service and letters to write and how lucky I was to be stationed in Hawaii. Then the sky exploded and everything changed. The person I was that morning died in the attack, killed by what I witnessed, by what I had to do, by the transformation that combat nursing required. I've been functioning for 4 years as someone else, someone I don't recognize, someone created by Pearl Harbor and everything that followed. She pauses, collecting thoughts, forcing herself to continue despite discomfort, despite vulnerability required for honesty. I've been in therapy for 4 months now, trying to process what happened, trying to heal from trauma I've carried since December 7, 1941. My therapist keeps asking me what Pearl Harbor means to me, what significance it holds beyond just being the day war started. I couldn't answer for a long time. But I think I know now. Pearl Harbor was the moment I learned that safety is illusion, that peace is temporary, that nothing protects us from war's capacity to destroy everything we believe about ourselves and our world. I learned that I could make choices I never imagined making, that I could witness suffering beyond anything I'd conceptualized, that I could continue functioning when everything suggested I should break. I learned I was stronger and more fragile than I knew, more capable and more damaged, more resilient and more broken. I've treated thousands of wounded men in 4 years. I've watched hundreds die. I've made impossible decisions about who receives treatment and who doesn't, who lives and who dies based on calculus of resource allocation that violates everything nursing school taught me. I've developed emotional calluses that allow me to function but that separate me from normal human feeling, that make me ghost haunting my own life, present but not really alive. The audience is completely silent, Alice's honesty creating discomfort and recognition simultaneously, her words capturing experiences many share but few articulate. She continues, her voice stronger now, finding courage in vulnerability. Pearl Harbor taught me that war doesn't just kill bodies. It kills the people we were before, kills innocence and optimism and belief in fundamental goodness. Every one of us who served, who witnessed combat, who treated the wounded or fought the enemy or survived when others died, we're all casualties. Some of us have visible wounds. Others carry invisible damage. But we're all casualties of war that took more than our time and our youth. It took pieces of our souls that can't be recovered, that remain forever at Pearl Harbor or Iwo Jima or Okinawa or wherever we saw things that can't be unseen, did things that can't be undone, became people we never wanted to be. But, she continues, her voice catching slightly, emotion breaking through practiced composure, Pearl Harbor also taught me that humans are capable of extraordinary courage, of impossible endurance, of maintaining compassion in circumstances designed to destroy it. I watched nurses work for 36 hours straight treating casualties. I saw doctors performing surgery under conditions that should have been impossible. I witnessed wounded men comforting each other despite their own suffering. I experienced moments of human connection that transcended the horror, that proved that even in war's worst moments, kindness survives, humanity persists, hope endures. I don't know if I'll ever heal completely from Pearl Harbor, from 4 years of war, from accumulated trauma that's transformed me permanently. My therapist says complete healing isn't possible, that some wounds leave permanent scars, that the goal isn't to become who I was before but to build new identity that integrates what I experienced, that honors what I survived, that allows me to carry the weight without being crushed by it. So today, on this 4th anniversary, I'm choosing to honor Pearl Harbor honestly. Not as day of heroism and glory and triumph, though those things existed, but as day of transformation and loss and learning terrible truths about war and about myself. I honor the men who died, whose suffering I witnessed, whose names I don't remember but whose faces haunt my dreams. I honor my fellow nurses, the ghosts haunting their own lives, the women who gave everything war demanded and received damage in return. And I honor the person I was before December 7, 1941, the Alice McKenzie who died that morning, who I mourn even while acknowledging that her death was necessary for my survival. She steps back from the podium, her remarks concluded, unsure how they were received, uncertain whether honesty helped or hurt, whether sharing trauma served purpose or just added burden to audience already carrying too much. The chapel remains silent for a long moment, her words settling, people processing what she shared, deciding how to respond to vulnerability that transcended expected memorial service platitudes. Then applause begins, quiet at first, then building, people standing, honoring her honesty, acknowledging her courage in speaking truth that official narratives obscure, in naming damage that polite society prefers to ignore. Alice accepts the acknowledgement awkwardly, uncomfortable with recognition, uncertain she deserves it, but recognizing that her speech resonated, that speaking truth mattered, that honesty served the dead and the living both. After the service, veterans approach her, nurses and doctors and patients, thanking her for articulating experiences they share, for giving voice to trauma they carry, for creating permission to acknowledge damage without shame. Several cry while speaking with her, their composure breaking, grief and relief mixing together, the weight of 4 years finally acknowledged publicly, finally validated as legitimate rather than weakness or failure. James Sullivan, the burned sailor she treated at Pearl Harbor, finds her in the crowd. He's been patient at Letterman for 18 months, undergoing multiple surgeries, skin grafts, reconstructive procedures, slowly rebuilding life that Pearl Harbor shattered. His face is scarred but recognizable, his recovery remarkable given his initial injuries, his survival itself minor miracle. I remember you, he says quietly. December 7th. You treated my burns. You stayed with me. You were honest about how bad it was. That mattered then. Your speech today matters too. Thank you for saying what we're all thinking but can't express. Thank you for honoring what Pearl Harbor really was, not the sanitized version but the truth. Alice nods, unable to speak, overwhelmed by recognition, by connection across 4 years, by knowledge that what she said resonated with the man whose suffering began the same day as hers, whose transformation paralleled her own, whose survival came at similar cost to his soul as hers did to hers. The months following the memorial service bring subtle changes, improvements too small to be dramatic but significant cumulatively. Alice continues therapy, continues processing, continues attempting to integrate 4 years of trauma into coherent narrative rather than carrying it as fragmented horror. The nightmares persist but decrease in frequency and intensity. Her appetite improves slightly, her weight stabilizing if not returning to normal. Her emotional capacity begins recovering incrementally, allowing brief moments of connection, of feeling something other than numbness and pain. She begins considering future, tentatively, without certainty but with possibility. She can't return to Nebraska, can't resume the life she left in 1940, can't pretend she's the person her family remembers. But maybe she can build something new, create existence that acknowledges who she's become rather than pretending to be who she was. Maybe she can work in Veterans Hospital, treating men who share her experiences, who understand what she carries, who won't require her to hide her damage. Maybe she can use her nursing skills and her combat experience and her hard-won understanding of trauma to help others process what they've survived. March 1946. Alice's extended active duty period is ending, her discharge finally proceeding, her transition to civilian status becoming real. Foster conducts final evaluation, assesses her progress, determines she's ready for discharge despite ongoing struggles, despite incomplete healing, despite carrying damage that will never fully resolve. "You've made remarkable progress," Foster tells her during their final session. "You're not healed completely and probably never will be. But you've developed coping mechanisms, you've processed significant trauma, you've begun rebuilding emotional capacity. Most importantly, you've accepted that you're changed permanently, that you can't return to who you were before Pearl Harbor, that healing means building new identity rather than recovering old one. That acceptance is crucial for continued recovery." Alice nods, recognizing truth in his assessment, understanding that she's a different person than she was 6 months ago, more whole if not completely whole, more functional if not completely functional, more capable of surviving civilian life even if she'll never thrive the way untraumatized people do. "What happens now?" she asks, genuine question, uncertain about next steps, about how to exist outside military structure that's defined her life for 6 years. "You keep doing the work," Foster says simply. "You continue processing, continue adapting, continue building life that accommodates what you carry rather than fighting it. You find purpose that uses your experience, that honors what you survived, that helps others who are struggling with similar trauma. You accept that some days will be harder than others, that nightmares will persist, that triggers will emerge unexpectedly, that healing isn't linear progression but cyclical process of improvement and setback and gradual overall progress. And you remember," he continues, "that you're not alone. Thousands of nurses served in this war, experienced similar trauma, carry similar damage. You're part of a community of survivors, women who gave everything war demanded and received wounds in return. That community can support you, can understand what others can't, can witness your struggle without judgment. Stay connected to that community. Don't isolate. Don't pretend you're fine when you're not. Ask for help when you need it. That's how you survive long-term." Alice accepts discharge on March 15, 1946, exactly 4 years and 3 months after Pearl Harbor, officially ending military service that transformed her completely, that took young naive nurse from Nebraska and returned damaged veteran capable of extraordinary things but broken in fundamental ways. She receives her discharge papers, her final pay, recommendations for veterans' benefits, standard bureaucratic conclusion to extraordinary service. She doesn't return to Nebraska. Instead, she accepts position at Veterans Hospital in Los Angeles, psychiatric ward treating combat veterans struggling with war neurosis, shell shock, combat fatigue, the various names given to psychological wounds that polite society prefers not to acknowledge. She'll work with men who understand what she carries, who share similar damage, who won't require her to pretend normalcy she doesn't possess. It's not the future she imagined at 22 when she enlisted, not the adventure she sought, not the life she planned. But it's life that makes sense given who she's become, that uses her experience meaningfully, that honors what she survived by helping others survive similar struggles. It's life built on foundation of trauma rather than despite it, existence that integrates Pearl Harbor rather than trying to escape it, identity that accepts transformation rather than mourning person she used to be. Years pass. Decades. Alice continues working in veterans' hospitals, treating generations of combat veterans, Korean War casualties and Vietnam veterans and Gulf War survivors, men carrying trauma from different conflicts but experiencing similar wounds, same psychological damage inflicted by different wars. She becomes expert in treating combat-related PTSD before it has official name, developing techniques and approaches, contributing to field of military psychology, writing about combat nursing and its psychological costs, advocating for better support for military medical personnel. She never marries, never has children, never builds traditional family life. Her relationships are mostly with other veterans, people who understand what she carries, who share similar damage, who don't require explanation or justification. She maintains connection with her nursing group from Letterman, women who remain friends through decades, who support each other through struggles civilian friends couldn't comprehend, who witness each other's survival and celebrate it quietly, who understand that continuing to exist year after year despite carrying Pearl Harbor is achievement worthy of recognition. She returns to Pearl Harbor once, in 1991 for the 50th anniversary of the attack, ceremony honoring the fallen, acknowledging the survivors, marking 5 decades since December 7th changed everything. She's 76 years old then, one of diminishing number of survivors who were actually there, who witnessed the attack firsthand, who carry memories of that morning in ways no history book can capture. Standing at the memorial, looking at the names of the dead carved in stone, thinking about wounded men she treated and couldn't save, she experiences complex emotions, grief and pride and loss and gratitude mixing together. She survived when so many didn't. She gave 50 years of service helping others survive their wars. She built life of meaning from foundation of trauma. These are achievements worth acknowledging even as she mourns everything Pearl Harbor took from her, everyone it killed, all the futures it erased. A young woman approaches her after the ceremony, journalism student researching nurses at Pearl Harbor, asking for interview, wanting to capture first-hand testimony while survivors remain alive. Alice agrees, tells her story one more time, describes December 7th and what followed, explains what war does to people who serve, what costs are hidden, what damage persists decades after combat ends. Do you regret it? The student asks finally. Enlisting, serving, spending 4 years in war zones? Would you do it again knowing what you know now about the cost? Alice considers carefully before answering, weighing complex truth against simple question. I regret the person I had to become, the transformation that was necessary, the loss of innocence and optimism and belief that world is fundamentally good. I regret the damage that will never heal, the nightmares that persist 50 years later, the emotional limitations that prevent normal relationships and simple joys. I regret that war took the best years of my life and returned different person in my body, stranger wearing my face who shares nothing essential with Alice McKenzie from Nebraska who enlisted in 1940. But, she continues, her voice firmer, I don't regret serving. Don't regret treating the wounded, helping who I could help, witnessing what needed witnessing, surviving to tell truth about war's costs. Someone had to do that work. Someone had to be there. If not me, then some other young nurse who would have been damaged similarly, who would have paid same price. The work mattered even though it destroyed us. The wounded deserved care even though providing it broke us. The testimony needed preserving even though remembering hurts. Would I do it again? She pauses, thinking about 50 years of carrying Pearl Harbor, of building life from trauma, of helping thousands of veterans while remaining damaged herself. Yes, despite everything. Despite the cost. Because the alternative, refusing to serve, protecting myself at expense of wounded who needed care, that would have been worse. That would have been cowardice. That would have been betrayal. I paid terrible price for serving. But I would have paid worse price for not serving. Some things matter more than personal cost. Some duties transcend self-preservation. That's what Pearl Harbor taught me. That's what I carried for 50 years. That's what I'll carry until I die. Alice McKenzie dies in 1998, 83 years old, 57 years after Pearl Harbor, lifetime removed from that Sunday morning that changed everything but still carrying it, still defined by it, still marked permanently by transformation that began December 7, 1941. She dies quietly in her sleep, no drama, no final words, just cessation of breath and end of consciousness and release from burden she carried since she was 26 years old. Her memorial service is attended by dozens of veterans she treated over decades, men whose lives she saved or improved, whose survival she supported, whose struggles she witnessed and validated. They speak of her kindness and competence, of her understanding and her refusal to judge, of her ability to see their damage without flinching, to acknowledge their suffering without trying to fix what couldn't be fixed. They speak of her as fellow survivor, as combat veteran who happened to be nurse, as woman who gave everything war demanded and somehow continued giving for 50 more years afterward. She's buried in military cemetery, her grave marked with simple headstone noting her service. Captain Alice McKenzie, Army Nurse Corps, Pearl Harbor survivor, 1915 to 1998. No mention of the thousands she treated, the lives she saved, the suffering she witnessed, the damage she carried, the 57 years of service after the day that should have destroyed her but somehow didn't. But the testimony remains, preserved in interviews and writings, in medical journals and historical archives, in memories of veterans she helped and students she taught and colleagues she influenced. Her story survives as representative of thousands of combat nurses, women who served and suffered and survived, who gave everything war demanded, who received damage in return, who built lives from trauma, who carried burdens civilian society preferred not to acknowledge. Pearl Harbor killed Alice McKenzie on December 7, 1941. But someone else survived, someone bearing her name and living in her body, someone created by that morning's trauma, someone defined by 4 years of war and 50 years of coping with its aftermath. That someone wasn't the person Alice McKenzie was supposed to become. But she was who Pearl Harbor made her. And she survived. Damaged but functional. broken but continuing. Ghost haunting her own life but still breathing, still serving, still witnessing, still testifying to costs that must be counted even when counting hurts. The nurse from Pearl Harbor. One woman among thousands. One story among millions. One life transformed by mourning that lasted 2 hours but extended across 57 years, that killed person she was and created person she became, that took everything she had and somehow wasn't enough to destroy her completely. That's the story. That's the testimony. That's what survives when the survivor finally stops surviving and succumbs to death that was delayed but never defeated, postponed but never prevented, waiting patiently for 57 years to claim what Pearl Harbor began taking that Sunday morning when the sky exploded and everything changed and Alice McKenzie learned what war really means and what it costs and what survives when everything else is destroyed. She survived. That's the victory. Small and insufficient and incomplete. But real. She survived. And in surviving she witnessed. And in witnessing she testified. And in testifying she preserved truth that must be preserved, that must be remembered, that must be honored even when honoring hurts. The nurse from Pearl Harbor. She survived. She testified. She died. But the truth remains. And that matters. Always. Forever. Pearl Harbor's legacy, written in one woman's damaged life, in 57 years of survival, in testimony that endures when the witness is gone. That's all. That's everything.